So continuing looking into what's unique about the Gospel of Matthew, which we started last week. And I'm going to continue into Mark and Luke, but first Matthew and a little more time spent on Matthew. And we can see what's unique about each of these Gospels by looking at stories, first of all, that are only in one, thinking about why did he include that story and no one else did, but also looking at stories that are in more than one, but they aren't told with exactly the same details or even the same level of detail. So why would that be? How does that tell us what the goals are? We said last week that Matthew definitely has a very Jewish flavor. He talks a lot about the Old Testament, and he seems to be trying to convince Jews Jesus was the Messiah. He was probably writing about 60 A.D., and at that point in time, there was still plenty of conflict between Christians and Jews. There were people being thrown out of synagogues in certain places if they accepted Jesus as Messiah. And so he wanted to focus on messianic prophecy, for example, and he makes a lot of Old Testament references. And we talked last time about how these aren't all direct prophecies. Some of them are typology. They're recurring patterns. But some of them are direct. Some of them are direct futuristic prophecy. And sometimes he doesn't give a quote. Sometimes he doesn't say, as the prophet Isaiah said. Sometimes there's just a phrase used that comes straight out of the Old Testament. And I think he realized that his Jewish audience would recognize Old Testament phrases and sentences because they were very steeped in it. So last week we started to look at the messianic references. And you can see right off the bat what's different about Matthew. Son of David, which is a messianic phrase in the Old Testament, and it refers to the fact that in the Old Testament, the Messiah is prophesied as a descendant of David. The seed of David, the branch of David, and these kind of words are used also in the Old Testament. Matthew wants to emphasize it. Son of David appears 9 times in Matthew, more than Mark and Luke combined. John doesn't use it at all. And only one of Matthew's examples is paralleled in Mark or Luke. And a lot of the times he was using Son of David in scenes where it was the crowd of people who followed Jesus calling him Son of David. Like when the blind men were crying out, Son of David, have mercy on us, heal us, and so on. And we asked last week, why would that be important for Matthew in 60 A.D. to quote that? Well, it's because he's showing Jesus isn't being invented as the Messiah in 60 A.D. This is not some new idea. The followers at the time, the common people at the time, not the Jewish leaders, obviously, but the common people at the time were recognizing that he was the Messiah. And so the common people, not just Matthew, but common people were using Son of David to refer to Jesus. And of course, there are direct futuristic prophecies. One of the most famous, the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. And then centuries later, what happens? He's born in Bethlehem. So that's the kind of messianic prophecy that we would expect. But then last week we also looked at a different kind of prophecy. Typology. His use of the Old Testament as typology, where it wasn't a futuristic prophecy in the first place. When Herod is killing the infants around Bethlehem, Matthew quotes from Jeremiah, Rachel weeping over her children. And Rachel was a type, like the mother of the nation of Israel. But what was Jeremiah talking about? He was talking about the Babylonian captivity. He wasn't making a prophecy about the future. But the Jews believed that the patterns of God dealing with his people repeated themselves, and that was a sign of the hand of God operating. So God's people were taken away from the promised land to Egypt, and then they were delivered out of Egypt. They were then taken away in captivity centuries later, but then they were brought back to the promised land. And Matthew was saying the same pattern is happening here. Jesus is taken off to Egypt to escape Herod. And then he's brought back out of Egypt. And so he quotes some Old Testament language about this pattern, but he's not claiming that Jeremiah was prophesying about Jesus. He's just pointing out that Jeremiah used this kind of Exodus language about the return from Babylon. And then we'll resume where we left off last week in Matthew chapter 3, verse 3. We see some of this typology. Talking about John the Baptist says, "For he is the one spoken of through the prophet Isaiah, who said, a voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make his paths straight." Now, when he refers to Isaiah, it would make you think that was some sort of futuristic prophecy by Isaiah. Well, it was. It was a futuristic prophecy, but it was at the time that they'd been carried off into Babylon. It was a futuristic prophecy about God bringing them back from Babylon. It wasn't directly a futuristic prophecy about Jesus. Isaiah used Exodus language in chapter 40 to talk about the future return from Babylon as being similar to that return from Egypt in the Exodus. And so Isaiah was saying this is the pattern. This is how God deals with his people. He will allow them to be enslaved somewhere, but he will always rescue them. And he will lead them out of the wilderness. John the Baptist is then a type of this Old Testament pattern. John the Baptist goes out in the wilderness not to prepare a way for the entire nation to come through the wilderness to the promised land, but he goes out in the wilderness to prepare a way for the Lord, meaning Jesus. So this is another subtle way that he uses the Old Testament language. On the other hand, you do get more direct messianic prophecy in the next chapter, Matthew chapter 4. When Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee, starting in verse 12 of chapter 4. He left Nazareth behind, and he went to live in Capernaum by the sea, in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, along the sea road beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who live in darkness have seen a great light. And for those living in the shadowland of death, light has dawned. Now, this was a messianic prophecy of Isaiah from the famous chapter 9 of Isaiah, which is full of messianic prophecy, including, we recall the verse, he shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Prince of Peace, saying that the Messiah will come someday, and he shall be called all these things, including God. Isaiah prophesied the Messiah, when he comes, will be called Mighty God. And so this should have informed the Jews, he's not just a man, he's not just a prophet, not just a teacher. When the Messiah comes someday, he shall be called Mighty God. And he shall go to the Gentiles. And a light shall come out of this Galilean region that isn't really very respected because it has a lot of Gentiles mixed in there. But, so this is Messianic prophecy. This isn't typology. This is Matthew quoting. Isaiah always said that from this Gentile-infused region that people down in Jerusalem didn't really respect, the Galilean region, shall come the light to the world, the Messiah. So they would know that the Messiah would come from there. And yet, they also had a prophecy the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. And so God had to arrange it. How can the Messiah be born in Bethlehem but be from the Galilean region? Well, through a sequence of events that happened. Right? Another emphasis in Matthew that shows us the divinity of Jesus is that Jesus was worshipped. Now, many times in the Bible, if an angel appears, for example, and someone starts to worship the angel says, "Stop that. I'm a man." In the book of Acts, when Paul and Barnabas are in a city and everyone starts shouting and worshiping him, and they don't understand the language, but once it's explained to them, they're saying that you're like gods. They're calling you Zeus and Mercury, and they're going out to get some oxen to sacrifice. They step forward and say, "Hey, stop. We're just men like you." It would be sacrilege to allow someone to worship you when you're just a man, right? But we see Jesus being worshiped, and he doesn't object. This word for worship, this Greek word for worship, means literally to fall down, to bow down, to fall down in front of someone. Has the root of prostrate, proskuneo. To fall down demonstrably worshiping someone. And it occurs many times in Matthew. What would cause Matthew to remember these instances more than Mark and Luke? Well, because he's writing to a Jewish audience, and it's important to Matthew to recite every instance he can remember in which Jesus was worshipped. Because he's trying to convince them, we're not inventing in 60 AD the idea that the Messiah is divine. We're not inventing it now. It was recognized at the time. Just as people cried out, "Son of David," they often fell down and worshiped him. Take a look at Matthew chapter 8, verse 2. To get one example. This is right after the Sermon on the Mount. It says, when he had come down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. Right away, a man with a serious skin disease came up and knelt before him, or fell down before him, worshiping him, saying, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." So this is an example. There are many examples where people are definitely worshiping Jesus. They're not worshiping the Father, but they're taking a worship word that's usually applied to worshiping the Father, and they're applying it to Jesus. They're physically bowing down before him to worship him. And they're expressing their belief in his divinity and in his divine power. Because, after all, what does that man say? he's got some leprosy or some skin disease that would be diagnosed as leprosy. It makes you unclean. You have to stay away from everybody else. And can you go to a doctor and get any relief from it? Was there, any treatment for such a thing back then? So the combination of falling down before Jesus, bowing down, combined with his words, I know you can make me clean, what does that mean? What is he saying? Is he saying Jesus is just a great teacher that I'm impressed with? He said, he's divine. He's the Son of God. He has God-like powers. That's what's being expressed here. Chapter 9, verse 18. As he was telling them these things, suddenly one of the leaders came and bowed down before him, saying, my daughter is near death. But please come. Come and by your hand on her she will live. So, this is another example where someone both bows down before Jesus and says, Jesus, you can do the impossible. You can raise someone from the dead. You can do what no doctor around here can do. And there's a physical bowing down going on. Matthew 14, verse 33. Jesus walked on the water, and then Peter tried to do it. And how did that go? Not too well. It says in verse 32, or 31, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught hold of him and said to him, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And then those in the boat worshipped him and said, truly you are the Son of God. Having witnessed Jesus walk on the water, there's no question anymore that he's just a teacher or a prophet, something like that. And so once again, they worshiped him, that is, they bowed down to him, and with their words, they said, you are the Son of God. So this is just a very strong flavor in Matthew of his theme. And so you think of it all related back to Matthew is probably aware of the Gospel of Mark. There are signs of it. There's occasionally some language borrowed from Mark, and most scholars believe Mark was written first, not all. But what was Mark? Well, we'll talk about that, but just in brief, we believe Mark was recording the gospel preaching of Peter in Rome. And Peter was preaching to, therefore, Gentiles, right? And so Matthew says, well, that's great. We have this gospel preaching to Gentiles recorded in Mark. I'm going to go write a gospel. And I'm not just going to duplicate Mark, because Mark's got a Gentile audience. He wants to write to the Jews. And if you piece together Matthew and Mark, you've got, more of the sum total of the gospel. Mark makes we'll get to this, but Mark makes almost no reference to the Old Testament at all. Why would you suppose that is? He's in Rome, what would that mean to them? Right? But for Matthew, showing the divinity of Jesus is very, very important. How are you going to convince Jews in the 60s AD that they should follow the Messiah? Isn't that kind of a tough sell when they see that some people are being cast out of the synagogue if they accept it? Some of them are being disowned by their parents when they're cast out of the synagogue? Matthew's got a tough job here if he wants to convince more Jews to follow Jesus. And so it's very, very important to Matthew as he recalls all the stories of Jesus' life. We know that each gospel author couldn't tell everything that they remembered. It wouldn't fit in a writing. You couldn't fit it on a scroll back then. Jesus taught for 3.5 years and did things for 3.5 years. You can read a gospel in an hour and a half or something, you know. That's 3.5 years into that gospel. So the gospel authors had to pick and choose. If something appears in one gospel but not in another gospel, does that mean that the other gospel author was unaware of it? Or it just means one gospel author chose this story and another one chose that story. Why? Because they had different purposes. For Matthew's purposes, the important stories to remember are the stories that show that Jesus was the prophesied Messiah and that Jesus was divine and was worshipped and accepted as Messiah at the time, and stories involving Jesus correcting the Jewish leaders, because Matthew is asking Jews in the 60s AD to stop following those Jewish leaders. So all of the stories in which Jesus rebuked those Jewish leaders and demonstrated that they were hypocrites and demonstrated that they were not teaching properly, those are going to be pretty important too, aren't they, for someone like Matthew? So that's another aspect of his preaching, is the conflict with the Jewish leaders. There's a lot of conflict with Jewish leaders. And you know, a lot of times all the Gospels enter our consciousness and we don't separate them. And we don't always realize that one Gospel has a whole lot more of something than another Gospel. There's a lot more conflict between Jesus and Jewish leaders in the Gospel of Matthew than there is, say, in the Gospel of Mark. And once again, why would that be? Why do Gentile Romans care to hear all about that when Peter's preaching the gospel to them? You know, they're not being weaned away from Jewish leaders, so why would they care? But for Matthew's purpose, remembering all of that is very, very important. And we'll talk about that next week. But, you know, and Matthew is, his memories on this are very detailed. And in fact, Matthew chapter 23, you want to look at that? That's the woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Oh, there's a whole chapter in Matthew collected together of Jesus condemning the Jewish teachers, which would be out of place in the Gospel of Mark, for example. So next week we'll finish up on Matthew here. Thank you.